But let's go back to Law 3.0 for a minute. This book argues that traditional legal approaches, what they call Law 1.0, just can't keep up with how fast drone technology is moving.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. The laws just weren't designed for this.
Exactly. And that's where Law 3.0 comes in. It's about embracing technology, using it to create a more, proactive and efficient regulatory system.
Right. We can't rely on old methods for a technology that's constantly changing. It's not sustainable.
So we talked about geofencing and remote identification, but are there other ways this Law 3.0 is being put into action? I mean, it sounds like a pretty radical shift.
It is. But think about it. We have sophisticated sensors and AI algorithms now that can analyze data from drones in real time.
So they can automatically detect potential violations.
Exactly. A drone exceeding speed limits, flying too close to restricted airspace, things like that.
It's like having a digital watchdog, constantly monitoring and preventing incidents before they even happen.
Exactly. And it's a crucial approach as drones become more autonomous, capable of making their own decisions.
That makes sense. But beyond safety, what are the benefits of this Law 3.0 approach?
Well, one of the most exciting aspects is that it could actually encourage innovation in the drone industry.
How so?
By having these clear technological guidelines and automating compliance, companies can focus on developing new, exciting applications.
So it's not about stifling progress with a bunch of red tape. It's about creating a system that encourages responsible growth.
Exactly. And another benefit is that it could actually free up regulatory bodies.
Free them up to do what?
To focus on more complex issues and strategic planning instead of getting bogged down in routine tasks.
So it's a win-win for both the industry and the regulators. But even with all this talk of Law 3.0, the regulatory landscape is still pretty complex, right?
It is. It's constantly changing, but that's what makes it so fascinating.
Okay, so what are some key things people need to know about current regulations? Is there a one-size-fits-all approach?
Not really. It definitely varies depending on where you are in the world. But one thing Drone Law 3.0 emphasizes is the importance of the EU's risk-based approach. They categorize drones based on their risk profile.
So a small drone taking pictures at a park would have different rules than, say, a large drone used for deliveries.
Exactly. It's about assessing the potential risks involved.
Makes sense. So are there any specific regulations or organizations that people should be aware of, regardless of where they're flying?
Absolutely. In the EU, you have the EU Implementing Regulation 219947, which covers the rules and procedures for drone operations.
So that's like the drone rule book.
Pretty much. And then there's the Delegated Regulation 219945. That focuses on unmanned aircraft systems and operators coming from outside the EU.
So separate rules for international operators.
Right. And then you have organizations like EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency.
What do they do?
They play a key role in developing and overseeing drone regulations. In the U.S., the FAA has a similar role.
Yeah, you're right.
And globally, there's the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, working to try and harmonize those regulations internationally.
Wow. It's like a whole network of organizations. But Drone Law 3.0 also talks about this distinction between normative and non-normative rules. What's the difference?
Well, think of normative rules as the official laws, the ones with legal consequences if you break them. Things like getting the proper licenses, staying within designated flight zones, that sort of thing.
Okay, so those are the hard and fast rules. What about the non-normative ones?
Think of those as more like guidelines, industry standards, best practices, things that encourage operators to go above and beyond just the bare minimum.
So like driving etiquette. There's no law that says you have to use your turn signal,
Right.
but it's good practice.
Exactly.
So what are some examples of non-normative rules in action?
Well, the book mentions DJI's GEO system. It's a geofencing technology that prevents drones from entering restricted areas, even if the operator tries to fly there.
So even if someone's intentionally trying to bend the rules, the technology can step in.
Exactly. It's like a built-in safety feature.
That's pretty impressive.
And another good example is the European use-based concept, which aims to integrate both normative and non-normative rules to manage traffic more effectively.
Sounds like a pretty comprehensive approach.
It is. It's about finding that balance between, legal consequences and those softer guidelines to create a more holistic approach.
So it's not just black and white. It's about blending different approaches to create a safer environment.
You got it.
But even with all these regulations and guidelines, we can't forget that one of the main goals is to foster innovation, right?
Absolutely. We don't want to stifle creativity and progress with too many rules.
So how do we find that sweet spot? Encouraging the development of new technology, but making sure it's used responsibly?
It's a delicate balancing act. One tool that the book highlights is the concept of regulatory sandboxes.
Regulatory sandboxes, what are those?
Imagine them as controlled environments where companies can test out new technologies and operational models without the fear of immediate penalties if something goes wrong.
So it's a safe space for experimentation and learning.
Exactly. A way to encourage innovation and gather real-world data without stifling creativity with overly rigid regulations.
It sounds like a win-win. Companies get to innovate, and regulators can learn from those experiments,
And another valuable tool is the use of pilot programs.
like beta tests for drone technology.
Exactly. Trying out new applications in real-world scenarios, but on a smaller, controlled scale.
So before rolling out a nationwide drone delivery service, they might test it in a smaller city first.
Exactly. To identify issues, refine those regulations, and just ensure a smooth transition.
So it's all about that feedback loop. Regulators and industry experts constantly learning from each other.
Absolutely. And that's why Drone Law 3.0 really emphasizes stakeholder engagement,
Stakeholder engagement.
bringing everyone to the table. Industry experts, policymakers, regulators, even the public.
To discuss the challenges and opportunities.
Exactly. Working together to create a regulatory environment that encourages both progress and responsibility.
It sounds like a very collaborative approach is key here.
It is. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone and making sure that ultimately this technology benefits society as a whole, not just a select few.
Couldn't agree more. So we've covered a lot. How drones are transforming industries, the importance of balancing innovation with responsibility, and this idea of Law 3.0.
It's a lot to take in.
But one thing this book makes very clear is the question of responsibility, especially with AI-powered drones.
Right. As they become more autonomous, it makes you wonder who is ultimately responsible when things go wrong.
Is it the operator, the manufacturer, or even the
Yeah.
algorithm itself? That's a big question.
It is a big question. And it's one we're going to be exploring as we continue our deep dive into Drone Law 3.0. So, as we dig deeper into this whole idea of responsibility, Drone Law 3.0 brings up this pretty interesting legal concept:
Okay, what's that?
strict liability.
Strict liability. Sounds intense. What does that even mean when we're talking about drones?
Basically, it means that in certain situations, the drone operator could be held responsible for damages caused by their drone, even if they weren't directly negligent.
Wait, so even if I did everything by the book, something goes wrong, it's still on me? That doesn't seem quite fair.
It might seem that way, but think about it. Drones, especially as they become more autonomous, they create these unique risks. They operate in a complex environment, right? Their actions can have, well, unintended consequences.
Okay, I see what you mean. So it's acknowledging that even with careful planning, things can still go sideways, and someone has to be accountable.
Exactly. Strict liability ensures that if someone's harmed, they have a way to seek compensation, even if it's tough to prove the operator was directly at fault.
That makes sense. Are there any real-life examples of this, where strict liability actually came into play?
Yeah, the book highlights a few incidents. One case from Germany really stands out.
Oh, what happened?
It involved a peregrine falcon.
A falcon? What does that have to do with drones?
Well, in Frankfurt, a drone pilot was flying near the roof of the Commerzbank Tower where peregrine falcons nest. And tragically, the drone struck and killed one of the falcons.
Oh, no.
Oh.
That's awful. What happened to the pilot?
Well, they faced criminal proceedings. The defense argued that the pilot, who was from Berlin, couldn't have known falcons nested on that specific building.
I mean, that makes sense, kinda.
Right. But the court decided that it's common knowledge that peregrine falcons nest on high-rise buildings in Frankfurt.
So even if it wasn't intentional, the pilot was still held accountable.
Exactly. While the case was settled with a financial payment, it highlights how strict liability could apply when drones cause harm to wildlife, even if the operator didn't mean to.
Wow. It really makes you think about all the different scenarios. What if a drone malfunctions, crashes into someone's property, or a delivery drone drops a package, someone gets hurt?
That's exactly where strict liability could come in. The book argues it encourages operators to be extra cautious, take all those precautions.
It's a good motivator to prioritize safety, knowing what's at stake.
Right, and it provides a way for victims to seek justice.
But, focusing just on the operator's liability feels a bit incomplete. Drones are complex, right? Shouldn't manufacturers, suppliers share some of that burden of safety?
You're absolutely right. The book addresses that too. It delves into product liability,
Product liability.
holding manufacturers and suppliers accountable for any defects in their products that cause harm.